The departure board at SeaTac flickered with names that looked like postcards from a dream. London, Rome, Paris, Barcelona. I stood there with my family, watching people rush past us. That low hum of excitement and anxiety that airports always carry. My name's Ethan Walker. I'm 40. A financial advisor out of Seattle. And I like to think I understand people. I've spent most of my adult life reading clients the way others read balance sheets. But nothing I'd ever learned about human behavior prepared me for what happened on that trip, or how it started. Dad was in his element that morning. Robert Walker, 65. Retired Air Force. Retired Boeing executive. Professional control freak. He stood in the middle of the check-in area, barking orders like we were about to invade Europe instead of vacation there. Linda, my mom, kept patting her purse, double-checking jewelry, passports, medications, as if any of that could stop him from snapping the moment something didn't go according to plan. My sister Chloe was busy filming herself for her vlog, talking about family memories and bucket list dreams, while her husband Mark held the camera, nodding along like a man who'd long accepted his role as background decoration. Then there was Grandma Maggie. She stood a little apart from the chaos, one small suitcase by her side, her posture straight, her chin lifted the way it always was when she wanted to look composed. Not fragile. She'd had her hair set the day before, wore a soft gray sweater and a pair of brand new walking shoes she'd bought for Paris. I still remember her smile. The quiet kind that didn't need attention. She was 81 and more alive than anyone else in that terminal. 6 months earlier. The trip had been Dad's idea. He'd pitched it during one of his Sunday lectures at dinner, talking about making memories while we still can. Like we were a project that needed completing before time ran out. First-class tickets, 5-star hotels, private tours, the full European experience. Chloe squealed and immediately started planning Instagram content. Mom asked about the luggage weight limits. I'd just smiled, half listening, because these moments always felt like theater. Family dinners at Dad's house were performances. He liked having an audience. But when Grandma said softly that she'd love to go, the air in the room changed. She'd been sitting at the head of the table, tracing her fingers over a glossy photo of the Eiffel Tower, and said it almost like an afterthought. Your grandfather always wanted to take me to Paris. She said, I think it's time I see it for both of us. For a second, everyone froze. Then Dad laughed awkwardly and said it was a sweet idea, but probably not practical. Too much walking. Foreign food. Long flights. Chloe chimed in that maybe Grandma could do something senior-friendly, like a cruise. It was supposed to sound caring, but it landed like pity. I watched Grandma straighten up. She wasn't angry, but something in her eyes shifted. I can walk just fine, she said. And I've been eating foreign food since before you were born. Richard. It was one of those quiet moments that made you realize she wasn't fragile. She was just tired of being treated that way. When she said she'd pay her own way, Dad stopped pretending to be polite. It's not cheap. Mom, he said, his voice flat. She nodded. I have money saved. James's life insurance and my savings. I've been saving for something special. This would be special. The room went quiet again. She didn't look at anyone. She just folded the brochure and smiled like she'd already made up her mind. Over the next few months, she proved it wasn't talk. She renewed her passport, took a beginner French class at the community center, bought travel clothes, walking shoes, even a neck pillow. Every time we met for coffee, she'd tell me something new she'd learned about the places we were going. Did you know? She said once. There's a cafe in Paris that's been open since the 1700s. Hemingway used to write there. She said it with the excitement of a teenager about to see the world for the first time. I think what moved me most was how much of herself she poured into it. She wasn't chasing luxury. She was chasing a memory. A promise she'd waited 60 years to keep. But under the surface, I could feel tension building. Dad sent her articles about elderly travelers getting scammed. Mom asked if she'd checked her medications with her doctor. Chloe worried she'd slow us down. Every comment sounded like concern, but felt like warning. Still, Grandma stayed cheerful. I've lived long enough to know when someone's trying to talk me out of something. She said to me once, they forget I raised the man doing it. The night before the flight, I stopped by her house. She had everything lined up in neat piles on the couch: travel documents, euros, maps, her itinerary. Everything's ready, she said proudly. I looked at her suitcase, at how carefully she'd folded her clothes, and something inside me softened. You sure about this? Grandma, it's a long trip, she smiled. I'm sure about everything except whether your father really wants me there. I didn't know what to say, so I hugged her instead. I can still remember how small she felt, but steady, like a tree that had weathered too many storms to fall easily. The next morning, at the airport, Dad moved with military precision. Passports out. Everyone, he said, even though we were still 10 minutes from the counter. Linda, stop fussing with your bag. Chloe, put that phone away. Mark, carry the big suitcase. Mother, do you have your documents? Grandma nodded, patting her purse. Right here. She'd shown them to me earlier: passport, travel insurance, flight confirmation. Everything perfectly organized. Watching her that morning, I realized how much this trip meant to her. It wasn't about seeing Paris. It was about proving she could still belong, that she wasn't finished yet. And looking at my father's face, that tight, performative smile, I realized something else. He wasn't proud she was coming. He was tolerating her presence. The way you tolerate an inconvenient truth. We were about to check in when he said something I'll never forget. He looked at her suitcase and laughed. Not cruelly, but dismissively. Like a man laughing at a child's toy. You sure that's all you need? Mom, he said, we don't want you getting left behind. He laughed again. A hollow sound that made her blush. I saw it in her eyes, the brief flash of embarrassment, then pride taking over. She smiled. I've carried heavier things than this. Richard. That moment stuck with me. His joke wasn't funny. It was foreshadowing. Though none of us knew it yet. I didn't know that laugh would echo in my head days later, when she stood in that same terminal, holding a useless passport and an empty promise. But that morning, we were still together, still pretending to be a family on the edge of a dream. Dad was already talking about the hotel in Paris. Chloe was live streaming to her followers, and Grandma was quietly watching the planes taxiing across the runway. Her reflection flickering in the window beside mine. She said, almost to herself, I can't believe I'm finally going. I turned to her, smiled, and said the words that would haunt me later. Nothing's gonna stop you now, Grandma. That night after we got back from the airport, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt staged, like everyone was pretending to be at peace. Dad had gone to bed early, saying something about wanting to be up before sunrise to finish packing. Mom sat in the living room polishing her jewelry, watching a rerun of some travel show about Tuscany. Chloe was editing her vlog, the sound of her keyboard tapping through the walls. Everything looked normal, but there was an edge to it, like a storm you could smell before it arrived. At dinner, Dad went over the itinerary one last time. His printed schedule spread across the table, like battle plans. He used that same commanding tone he used to have in the Air Force, the one that didn't invite conversation. Flights to London first, 2 nights there, then on to Paris, Rome after that, then back through Zurich. He didn't look up once. I noticed Mom's hand trembling a little when she poured wine. She always got nervous before his trips, even vacations. Chloe was in full performance mode, talking about how she was going to document the whole experience for her subscribers. Dad, you should let me do an interview with you about being a veteran and world traveler. It would give the vlog some depth. He gave her a tight smile. I'm not here to give interviews. Just make sure you don't hold us up. Grandma was sitting at the far end of the table, her plate half empty, her eyes wandering between all of us. When Dad mentioned the private tour in Paris, she smiled. The Louvre has been on my list since I was a girl, she said softly. Chloe barely looked up from her phone. Oh, it's huge. You probably won't want to walk all that way. Maybe we can split up. Something in Grandma's smile faltered, but she kept her tone light. If I can't walk through the Louvre at 81, then what was all that yoga for? I laughed quietly. But Dad didn't. He turned to Mom. We should keep an eye on her medications. Foreign pharmacies can be tricky. Mom nodded. Too quickly. And said, I packed an extra pill organizer. Just in case. It was subtle. But it was there. The way they kept talking about her like she wasn't at the table. Like she was luggage that needed managing. I caught Grandma's eye once. And she gave me that small, knowing look she used when she wanted to say, don't make a scene. I let it go. I always did. After dinner, Mom went to clear the plates and Dad followed her into the kitchen. I stayed behind to help Grandma collect her things. Through the half-closed door, I could hear their voices. Mom's was low. Worried. Dad's was sharp. That clipped tone he used when he thought someone was questioning him. I didn't catch every word. But I heard enough. If she's really transferring the money, I'll handle it, he said. She'll feel included without being a problem. My stomach tightened. Handle it. That was his phrase when he meant something was already decided. When he was a colonel, it meant someone was getting reassigned. In a family setting, it meant someone was getting cut out. Grandma came back into the room, folding her cardigan over her arm. Everything all right? She asked. I forced a smile. Yeah. Just Dad being Dad. She nodded. Like that explained everything. He's always needed to be in charge, she said quietly. Even when he was a boy, he used to reorganize his toy soldiers every night before bed. I wanted to ask if she trusted him with the money. But I didn't. It wasn't my place. Not yet. She'd already sent the transfer. She'd told me over coffee the week before, I don't want to owe anyone. She'd said, I've lived long enough to pay my own way. I admired her for that. But now, sitting there watching Dad whisper in the kitchen, I started to wonder if independence and vulnerability were closer than I'd ever realized. The next morning, I went by her house to drop off a power adapter I'd bought for her. She was standing in the kitchen, humming, wrapping up the last of her things. Everything's ready, she said. Your father called to confirm he's booked all 6 tickets. She smiled, proud, like she was finally part of something. I nodded. But a question burned in the back of my mind. Did he send you the confirmation? She looked puzzled. He said it was all on his account. Group booking. No need to double up. I swallowed whatever instinct told me to push harder. Instead, I handed her the adapter. For your phone. So you can call me from Paris. She laughed. Oh. Ethan. I'll be too busy drinking wine and people watching to call you. She was glowing. I didn't have the heart to break that light. That evening, Dad called me to review final details. His voice was casual, but I could hear the pride underneath. First class all the way. I made sure everyone's taken care of. I asked about Grandma's ticket, keeping my tone even. You booked her seat next to you. Right. He paused a little too long. Of course, he said. Don't start micromanaging me. The old defensive note in his voice made me uneasy. I let it slide. But the doubt lingered. That night, the family gathered for one last dinner before the flight. Mom had made her signature roast chicken. Chloe had her camera propped on the counter, filming snippets of laughter and clinking glasses. It was all so normal, so staged. Grandma gave a toast, her voice trembling with emotion. I just want to thank you all, she said. This trip means more to me than you can imagine. James and I always dreamed of seeing Paris together. I think he'd be happy knowing I'll see it now. Everyone clapped politely. Dad smiled. But his eyes were elsewhere. I caught it again. That flicker of calculation. It was gone as fast as it came, replaced by that fake warmth he'd perfected over decades of command. We're glad you're coming, Mom, he said. It'll be the trip of a lifetime. Later, when everyone left the table, I lingered with her. She was folding her napkin, lost in thought. You're quiet, she said. I shrugged. Just thinking. She studied me, the way only she could. You don't trust him. I hesitated. I want to. But sometimes he treats people like assets. Things to manage. She smiled sadly. He's been that way since the Air Force. You can't unlearn control. When I got home that night, I couldn't shake it. Her words. His tone. The way Mom flinched when he spoke. It all felt connected. Like threads pulling tighter. I told myself I was being paranoid. That Dad was an asshole but not a thief. Still, I opened my laptop, pulled up my work calendar, and made a note under next week's date. Check Grandma's flight details. It felt like overkill. Like something a suspicious son would do. But I couldn't help it. I'd seen that flicker in his eyes before. When he was hiding something, I just didn't know what. When I finally turned off the light, I imagined her smile in that kitchen. The way she'd said she was finally part of something. And for the first time in years, I hoped I was wrong about my own father. The morning of the flight felt like the start of something big. The kind of day people talk about years later when they say everything changed. The sun was just coming up over the Sound when I pulled into the airport parking lot. The sky was washed in that pale gray light. Seattle wears like a habit. I spotted Dad's SUV near the drop-off area. Hazard lights blinking. Him standing there in his pressed blazer, checking his watch like he was timing a launch. Mom waved when she saw me. "You're late," she said. Even though I wasn't, Chloe had her phone on a tripod, narrating to her followers about the family adventure of a lifetime. Mark was half asleep beside her, pushing the luggage cart, and Grandma, standing just off to the side, looked like she'd stepped out of a travel magazine. New hat, gray coat, her favorite brooch pinned neatly at the collar. She looked proud, hopeful. Dad was already barking orders. "Everyone check your passports. Chloe. Camera away. Mom, don't wander off. Ethan. Grab that extra suitcase." He moved like a man who couldn't relax unless he was in command. I grabbed the suitcase but couldn't help noticing how tense he looked. He wasn't enjoying this. He was performing it. Grandma walked beside me as we headed inside. "Your father's nervous," she whispered. "He's always been that way before trips." I smiled, trying to keep it light. "Yeah. Except this isn't a mission. It's just Europe." She laughed softly, but her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. Inside, the terminal buzzed with that usual chaos: kids crying, people rushing, suitcases thumping on tile, the smell of coffee and jet fuel. Chloe kept vlogging, asking each of us to say something for her intro clip. Dad rolled his eyes but played along. "Ready to make memories," he said, flashing his rehearsed smile at her phone. I caught Grandma's reflection in the lens behind him, looking like she belonged in another story entirely. We reached the check-in counter. Dad stepped forward, presenting his phone with that same confidence he used to walk into boardrooms. "Walker family. 6 tickets. First class to London," he said. The agent typed, nodded, smiled politely. Then her brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I see 5 passengers on this reservation, not 6. The air shifted. Dad laughed. The sound sharp, humorless. "That can't be right. There should be 6. My mother's traveling with us." The woman checked again, clicking keys, her tone professional but cautious. "I have Robert Walker, Linda Walker, Ethan Walker, Chloe Rivera, and Mark Rivera. No Maggie Walker." Grandma blinked. "That's odd," she said gently. "You booked my ticket, didn't you?" "Richard." For a second, Dad froze. Then he forced another laugh. Louder this time. There must be a system glitch. These things happen all the time. I stepped closer to look at his phone screen. He was scrolling through emails. Fast. Like a man looking for an alibi. For a split second, the phone tilted, and I saw it. Subject line: refund processed. Underneath, a line that burned into my brain. Card ending 5,512. That was his card. I didn't react right away. My stomach turned cold. The kind of cold that starts somewhere deep and spreads outward. He must have felt my eyes on him because he turned slightly, covering the screen. "Don't crowd me, Ethan," he muttered. The agent looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I can check again. But if the ticket was refunded or never issued, she won't be able to board." Grandma stood there, small but steady, clutching the handle of her suitcase. "Refunded," she repeated softly. "That's impossible. I paid for it weeks ago." Chloe lowered her camera, finally realizing this wasn't content. Mom fidgeted with her purse strap, avoiding everyone's eyes. Mark whispered, Maybe it's just a mistake. But even he didn't sound convinced. I turned to Dad. Did you cancel her ticket? He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Of course not. Don't be ridiculous. I nodded slowly. Then show her confirmation. He exhaled through his nose. Irritated. Then tapped at his phone. It's right here. He stopped. You know what? Forget it. We're wasting time. I'll handle it with the airline later. We need to get through security. The agent's voice was apologetic but firm. Sir. Without a valid boarding pass. She can't go through. That was when I lost it. You're not handling anything. You took her money and canceled her seat. Didn't you? The people in line turned to look. Dad's face flushed. That shade of red that used to precede his temper. Watch your tone. He hissed. You have no idea what you're talking about. But I did. I'd seen that email. I'd seen the subject line. The card number. And I knew him well enough to recognize guilt when it flickered behind his eyes. Grandma's voice cut through the tension. Quiet but trembling. Richard. Please. Tell me it's a mistake. He opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Finally. He muttered. We can sort this out later. Mom. Just wait here. Wait here, she asked. Barely above a whisper. He nodded like it was nothing. They won't hold the plane forever. That was it. That was the moment something in me snapped. I stepped in front of her. If she's not going, I'm not going. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Don't be dramatic. She'll get on the next flight. I held up my phone. Camera app open. Say that again. His expression darkened. You're threatening your own father now. I'm asking you to own what you did. He leaned closer. His voice low and venomous. You don't understand what's at stake. You've always been naive. Maybe. I said. But I'm not blind. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the agent didn't move. Finally. Dad turned. Handed over his passport. And said flatly. Check the rest of us in. Grandma reached for his arm. Please. Richard. Don't leave me here like this. He pulled away. You'll be fine. And just like that. He walked off toward the gate with Mom trailing after him. Eyes down. Chloe stood frozen for a second. Then followed. Still holding her camera like it weighed 100 pounds. I turned back to Grandma. She was shaking. Not from anger but from disbelief. He wouldn't do that. She whispered. As if saying it out loud might make it true. I swallowed hard. He just did. We stood there. Surrounded by strangers, pretending not to watch. I took her suitcase from her hand and said, Let's go home. As we walked back toward the parking lot, her reflection passed over every glossy surface shop windows. Polished floors. The glass doors sliding open. She looked smaller somehow. Like the world had taken a piece of her and wasn't giving it back. Neither of us spoke until we reached the car. Then she said, quietly, Your father used to hold my hand in this same airport when he was a boy. He said one day he'd take me to see the world. I gripped the steering wheel and stared at the terminal lights. He still could have. I said, He just chose not to. She nodded slowly. Eyes fixed on the departing planes. Then the world can wait. She said, But I won't forget. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the road. Somewhere behind us. The flight to London was lifting off. And with it, whatever illusion we'd been holding on to about being a family. When we pulled into Grandma's driveway, the sky was already turning that flat, gray-blue color that always follows disappointment. She sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap, still clutching her boarding pass like it might somehow start working again if she held onto it long enough. I turned off the engine, but neither of us moved. The sound of the cooling motor filled the silence between us. She was the first to speak. I don't understand. Ethan. Why would he do that? Why would my own son cancel my ticket? I wanted to have an answer. I wanted to tell her it was a mistake. That there was some bureaucratic glitch or airline error. But I couldn't. I had seen that email. Refund processed. Card ending 5,512. It wasn't an accident. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and lemon polish. The way it always did when she'd spent the day cleaning. She put her suitcase down by the couch and sat. I watched her eyes move over the photos on the wall. The family pictures she'd framed over the years. Robert in uniform. Me and Chloe as kids on Christmas morning. Her and Grandpa James on their wedding day. Standing in front of a Ford Fairlane. Both of them laughing. She looked so small sitting there. I sat next to her and said quietly, "Grandma, I need you to tell me exactly what you gave him." She turned to me slowly. 30,000. She said, "From the joint account I kept open after your grandfather passed. I told him I wanted to help with the group booking. And he said it would be easier if I sent it to him directly. So I did. He even thanked me." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you get any confirmation from him afterward?" "He said the tickets were all under one itinerary. That's why my name wasn't on the individual receipt." She sighed. I trusted him. "Ethan." I didn't even think to ask. I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. The kind that doesn't explode but lingers. Heavy and hot. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through the photos, and showed her the one I'd taken at the airport. The subject line glared back at us. "Refund processed." Her lips trembled. But she didn't cry. She just stared at it, her eyes glistening. "So he really did it," she said softly. "He really took it back." I nodded. "Yeah, he did." For a while, we just sat there. I could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, the wind pressing against the windows. Finally, she spoke again. "You shouldn't have stayed behind. Ethan, you'll regret missing the trip." I shook my head. "No, Grandma. The only thing I'd regret is getting on that plane and pretending everything was fine." She smiled weakly. That tired kind of smile that comes after too many disappointments. "You've got your grandfather's stubborn streak," she said. Later that night, after she went to bed, I sat alone at her kitchen table. The same table I used to do my homework at when I was a kid. The same table where Grandpa James taught me how to balance a checkbook. I opened my laptop, logged into my email, and started searching. I found the refund confirmation. It wasn't hard. The email from the airline was time-stamped 2 days before our flight. Refund issued to card, ending 5,512. Passenger name, Margaret Walker. Amount refunded 5. Ling Er. Sicherliu. It wasn't just the cancellation, it was the smug precision of it. He'd planned this. I forwarded the email to my personal account and then to my friend Tyler, a guy I'd known since college who worked in compliance at North Star Capital. Tyler was one of the few people who actually believed in ethics in finance. I attached a note that said, "Keep this. Might need it later." When my phone buzzed an hour later, it was him. "Jesus. Ethan. He really did this, yeah." He whistled low. "You're gonna have to report this." "Man. That's elder fraud." "I know. I just don't want to break her more than she already is. She's tougher than you think," he said. "But you can't let this slide." After I hung up, I poured a glass of water and stared at the window. The reflection showed my own face, pale and tired. I thought about how many times I'd defended my father over the years. When he yelled at Mom, when he belittled Chloe, when he talked to Grandma like she was a burden instead of the woman who raised him. Every time, I'd told myself he was just strict, just proud, just complicated. Now I realized he was just cruel. In the morning, Grandma was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Her suitcase was still by the door. Untouched, I sat down across from her. "I found the email," I said. "I know you did," she said. "I could hear you typing last night." I waited for her to say something else, but she didn't. Finally, she said, "I keep wondering if I did something to make him hate me." "You didn't," I said quickly. "He's just—" I stopped. There was no polite way to say what he was. She looked out the window, where the rain had started to fall in thin lines. "Your father's been chasing respect his whole life," she said. "He never realized it's not something you can steal." I took her hand. "We can fix this. I'll find a way to make him give it back." She gave me a tired smile. "You can't fix people, Ethan. You can only stop them from hurting others." That afternoon, a text came in from my father. No apology, just 10 words. "You embarrassed this family today. Don't make it worse." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I typed back, You did that all on your own. He didn't respond. By evening, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let it end like this. I opened a folder on my laptop and created a new document labeled Evidence. I uploaded the refund email, screenshots of the transfer Grandma had made to his account, and the photo from the airport. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Before bed, I checked on Grandma one last time. She was asleep in her recliner, the TV still on low volume. A travel commercial was playing, showing an older couple walking along the Seine at sunset. She looked peaceful, her face lit by the glow of the screen. I turned off the TV and covered her with a blanket. When I stepped outside, the night air was cold and sharp. I looked up at the sky, thinking about the flight to London that was probably halfway across the Atlantic by now. Dad would be sipping champagne, smiling for Chloe's camera, telling the world how lucky we were to have each other. But I knew better. I knew the truth behind the smile, the greed behind the pride, and I knew one day soon, he was going to learn what it felt like to be left behind. The phone rang early the next morning. I was still half asleep, sitting at Grandma's kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, when I saw the name flash across the screen. Harold Grant, my boss at North Star Capital, the kind of man who called only when something was wrong. I answered, trying to sound alert. Hey, Harold. His tone was clipped, polite in that way people are when they are about to fire you. Ethan, we need to talk. Can you come in today? I stared at the steam rising from the coffee, already knowing what was coming. Sure. I'll be there in 30. The drive to the office felt longer than usual. Seattle traffic was slow. Gray clouds hung low over the freeway, and the sound of wipers scraping across the windshield matched the pulse in my head. When I parked, I saw Harold's Mercedes already in his spot, gleaming like it had never been outside. He was always the first to arrive when bad news needed delivering. Inside, the office was quiet. My coworkers gave me that look, the one that said they knew something I didn't. When I walked into Harold's glass-walled office, he stood behind his desk, hands folded like a priest. Ethan, he said, gesturing for me to sit. I wanted to speak with you face to face. It's about your father. There it was. I took a seat but didn't say anything. He continued. Robert called me last night. He's very upset. Apparently there was an incident at the airport. I kept my tone even. He left my grandmother behind after taking her money. Harold's mouth tightened into a line. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. He sighed and leaned back. Your father's been a respected figure in this city for decades. Boeing, the veteran community, Rotary Club. People know him. He says you overreacted and created a scene. I almost laughed. Yeah. A scene where the truth came out. Ethan, he said, lowering his voice. I'm not taking sides here, but perception matters in our field. Clients talk, and your family name carries weight, good or bad. So you're saying my job depends on protecting my father's reputation? He looked uncomfortable, which told me everything. Take some time off. A few weeks. Let things cool down. We'll revisit when this situation settles. I stood up. You're firing me. I'm giving you space. I nodded slowly. Right. Space. I walked out without shaking his hand. By the time I reached the parking garage, I wasn't angry, just numb. My father had always been skilled at manipulation. But this was different. He'd managed to turn his guilt into my consequence. When I got back to Grandma's, she was in the garden, pulling weeds. The woman couldn't sit still even after being humiliated. I crouched next to her. You don't have to do this right now. She smiled faintly. Keeps my hands busy. Otherwise I'd start thinking. I hesitated, then told her about the call. He got me suspended. Maybe worse. Her hand stopped moving. He's trying to isolate you. Ethan. That's what people like him do when they feel cornered. People like him, she met my eyes. Your father's always been afraid of losing control. When you took my side, you took away his favorite weapon, obedience. I let that sink in. She was right. Inside, I poured her some tea while she went to change her gardening gloves. My phone buzzed again. Tyler this time. He didn't bother with small talk. I looked into what you sent me. You've got solid proof of refund fraud. I also ran the numbers from the account transfer you mentioned. Guess what? What the transfer went into one of your father's investment accounts at Bank West. The same one he uses for consulting payments. He didn't even bother hiding it. My chest tightened. You're kidding. Nope. And if he used her money for personal expenses? It's elder abuse under Washington law. You could report it. I looked toward the hallway where Grandma was humming softly. I don't want to drag her through that. She doesn't need to testify right away. Just start the process. It's about leverage. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the dark TV screen. Leverage. My father had always understood that word better than love. Maybe it was time I did too. That evening, I drove across town to see someone Grandma had mentioned years ago. Bill Cheney, her old friend from college. A retired lawyer who still did consulting work from his home office in Bellevue. His porch light was on when I arrived, casting a warm glow over a yard full of azaleas. He opened the door before I could knock twice. You must be Maggie's grandson, he said. His voice gravelly but kind. She called this afternoon. Said you'd be coming by. Inside. His living room looked like a museum of old cases, framed newspaper clippings. Law books. Photos of him shaking hands with judges and mayors. He gestured for me to sit. Tell me what happened. I told him everything. The refund. The money transfer. The confrontation at the airport. When I finished, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That's not just immoral. That's criminal. If she transferred the money under false pretenses, and he used it for himself, that's financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I frowned. Vulnerable. She's sharp as hell. He nodded. Doesn't matter. The law uses age, not capacity, for that threshold. And if you can prove intent, it's open and shut. He leaned forward. Do you have documentation? I handed him the folder. I'd compiled the screenshots. The emails. The transaction records. He flipped through them, nodding slowly. This is good. Very good. I'll reach out to the Attorney General's office in Olympia tomorrow. They handle elder abuse investigations. Something in my chest eased for the first time in days. So this could actually work. Oh, it'll work, he said with a small smile. Men like your father think their reputation makes them untouchable. The law loves proving them wrong. When I left, the night was cool. The streets quiet. I drove with the windows down, letting the air clear my head. For the first time since the airport, I felt something close to calm. Not peace. Not yet. But purpose. Back home. Grandma was waiting up. She had a blanket over her knees and a mug of chamomile tea in her hands. How did it go? She asked. Good. I said. He's helping us. You might get your money back. She smiled faintly. It's not about the money, Ethan. It's about what he took from me. I know. I said. But maybe this time he doesn't get to walk away. She nodded slowly. Then do what you have to do. I went to bed that night with my laptop open on the nightstand. The folder labeled evidence glowing on the screen. I thought about Dad somewhere over in Europe, smiling for pictures, playing the part of the devoted father. Maybe he thought the distance made him safe. He was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Bill. One sentence. Contact made. Case accepted for preliminary review. For the first time in my life, I realized my father wasn't the one in control anymore, and I intended to keep it that way. The first thing I did that morning was call Tyler. He picked up on the second ring, his voice still thick with sleep. Tell me you didn't get arrested, he said. Not yet, I said. But I might have started something. He groaned. You sound way too calm for that sentence. What did you do? I filed a case. Officially. There was a long pause. Then a sharp laugh. You're serious. You actually went for it. Bill helped me. He got the Attorney General's office to open a review. It's in motion now. Tyler whistled low. That's a big deal. You realize if they go through with it, they'll dig into everything. Your dad's accounts, his tax records, maybe even your mom's assets. I know. You ready for that kind of war? I've been in one my whole life, I said. I just finally stopped pretending it was peace. After we hung up, I poured myself another coffee and sat on Grandma's porch. She came out a few minutes later, wearing her robe and slippers, her silver hair pulled back neatly. She looked like she'd slept better than I had. She sat beside me, took the mug from my hand, and took a sip without asking. "So," she said. "What happens now?" I smiled faintly. "Now we wait. The investigators will review the evidence. Then they'll contact him." She gave a slow nod. "You think he'll understand what he's done?" "No," I said. "But he'll finally have to face it." The following week was a blur. The Attorney General's office requested statements, financial records, and the correspondence between Grandma and my father. Bill helped us prepare everything. He was meticulous, methodical, the kind of man who didn't waste a word. Meanwhile, my father's silence stretched on. No calls, no messages, no half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. It was almost worse than his anger. I imagined him somewhere in Europe, sipping wine with my mother, convincing himself this was all a misunderstanding that would go away on its own. Then, 3 days later, it didn't. It started with a call from Bill. "They served him this morning," he said. He was at a hotel in Rome. The investigators reached him through the embassy. I felt a strange rush in my chest. Not joy, not satisfaction, but something cold and quiet. What did he say? According to my contact, he was caught off guard, tried to claim you forged the documents, said he never received the money. Of course he did. Bill chuckled softly. They didn't believe him. They froze one of his domestic accounts for verification. It's only a temporary hold, but it'll get his attention. That night, I got the first call from my mother. Her voice was tight, sharp with fear. "Ethan, what have you done? You've humiliated us." I didn't respond right away. I could hear the clink of silverware, the faint hum of conversation behind her. She was calling from a restaurant. "Humiliated," I said. "He stole $30,000 from his own mother." "I'd say that's the humiliating part. You don't understand," she said. "He had reasons. He thought she'd back out at the last minute. The refund was just stop." I said, "You don't have to make excuses for him anymore." Her voice broke slightly. "You're destroying this family." "No," I said quietly. "He already did. I'm just refusing to pretend otherwise." I hung up before she could say anything else. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. Grandma was in the living room when I walked in. She was watching the evening news but muted the TV when she saw my face. "That was your mother, wasn't it?" "Yeah, she's scared," Grandma said softly. "But she's not your responsibility." "I know," I said. "Still feels wrong." She reached out and took my hand. Doing the right thing usually does. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm of updates and tension. The investigation moved faster than I expected. They traced the refunded ticket payment directly to my father's personal account, then tracked withdrawals in Europe matching the same amount. Bill called again on a Friday afternoon. "They're offering him a settlement," he said. "He has 30 days to repay the full amount, plus restitution. Or they'll file criminal charges. And if he doesn't, he will," Bill said dryly. "Your father's pride might be endless, but his fear of a courtroom isn't." That night, I took Grandma out to dinner. It wasn't fancy, just a small Italian place in Ballard she'd always liked. She ordered spaghetti with meatballs, the same thing she'd had on her anniversary every year. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me and said, "You know, James always wanted to go to Italy." I smiled. "Guess we'll have to go for him." She laughed softly. "At this rate, we might even be able to afford it again." 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a cashier's check for $34,000 and a typed note that read, "For expenses related to the misunderstanding, consider the matter resolved." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I placed the note on the counter and handed Grandma the check. She stared at it for a long time, then said, "He thinks money makes this better." "It doesn't," I said. "But it's something." She nodded slowly. "It's proof." That evening, I found her sitting in the den with a map spread across the table. Paris, Rome, Zurich, all the places she dreamed of visiting. Her fingers traced the lines between them. "I was thinking," she said, "maybe I still take that trip. By yourself." She smiled. "Maybe not. You ever been to Europe?" "Ethan," I laughed. "Not yet. I was supposed to be." She looked up at me, her eyes steady and full of something fierce. Then let's go. Not to show anyone. Not to prove anything. Just because we can. For a second, I didn't answer. I thought about everything we'd been through. Everything she'd lost and still refused to let define her. Yeah, I said finally. Let's do it. The following weeks became a blur of planning. Passport renewals. Flight bookings. Hotel research. I caught her practicing French on YouTube videos. Scribbling phrases in a notebook. Every time I saw her smile, it felt like something inside me was being rebuilt, piece by piece. One night, as we were finalizing the itinerary, my phone buzzed with another message. It was from an unknown number. A single sentence. You think you've won, but you don't know what you've started. I showed it to Grandma. She read it, then handed it back. He's scared, she said calmly. Let him be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. My father might have lost this battle, but he wasn't the kind of man to surrender quietly. When I went to bed that night, I caught myself thinking about that first moment at the airport. The flicker in his eyes when the agent said there were only 5 tickets. It wasn't guilt I'd seen. It was calculation. And for the first time, I realized the story wasn't just about stolen money or a broken promise. It was about power, and I wasn't sure either of us was done fighting for it. I couldn't stop thinking about that message. It wasn't just a threat. It felt like a warning. The kind my father had always delivered in subtle ways when I was younger. A look across the dinner table. A tone in his voice. The way he could make silence feel like punishment. But this was different. This was him realizing he'd lost control. A few days later, I was in my office cleaning out my desk when Harold called me in. He closed the door behind me. His expression unusually tight. Ethan, you might want to sit down for this. I stayed standing. If it's about my father, I already know. He exhaled slowly. It's not just him. Someone called the partners board last night. Claimed you'd been leaking confidential client information to regulators. They said you were retaliating against your family. I stared at him. That's ridiculous. I know. Harold said. But perception is reality in this business. We're investigating. But in the meantime, we're suspending your access to all active accounts. I almost laughed. So he wins again. Harold didn't answer. I could tell he felt bad. But not bad enough to risk his own position. I picked up the box of my things, looked him in the eye, and said, You know, Harold, sometimes doing nothing is the same as helping the wrong side. When I got back home, Grandma was making soup. The smell filled the kitchen. That mix of thyme and chicken broth that always made the place feel like safety. She looked up from the stove. Rough day. Yeah, I said. He got to my job. She frowned but didn't look surprised. Of course he did. You cornered him. Ethan, men like your father only know how to fight dirty. I sat down at the table. I just don't get it. He already got his money back. What's he still trying to prove? That he can still control the narrative. It's not about the truth to him. It's about being right. Later that evening, I got another message. This time from my sister, Chloe. It just said, You've gone too far. He's saying you're trying to ruin him. I typed back. He ruined himself. Then I put my phone face down and walked outside. The night air was cool. And the neighborhood was quiet except for a dog barking somewhere down the block. I sat on the porch steps. The same ones I used to sit on when I was a kid waiting for Dad to pick me up after baseball practice. Half the time he never showed. Grandma always did. I thought about calling him, just to see what he'd say. Maybe I wanted to hear him admit it. Or maybe I just wanted him to sound human again. But then I remembered how easily he lied. How he could twist any situation into his own version of the truth. I deleted the idea before it could grow. The next morning, Bill called. I heard about your suspension. He said, I'm sorry, Ethan. But listen, we're not done yet. I've been talking to a reporter from the Seattle Herald. They're doing a story on financial exploitation cases. If you and your grandmother are willing to talk, it could put real pressure on him. I hesitated. You mean go public? Exactly. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. He can't bully the press the way he bullies people. I looked over at Grandma, who was trimming flowers in the yard. The sunlight hit her hair. And for the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful. Let me talk to her, I said. That night, I told her about Bill's idea. She listened without interrupting, then set her gardening shears down. I don't want to humiliate him, she said quietly. He's still my son. I know. But if we stay quiet, he'll just keep doing this. He's already trying to destroy me to save himself. She sat back, thinking, what would I have to do? Just tell the truth. I said, about what happened, about the money, about him. She sighed. The truth used to mean something to your father. Before the promotions, before the titles. I think he lost it somewhere along the way. I waited. Finally, she nodded. All right. We'll do it. But I'm not doing it for revenge. Ethan. I'm doing it so nobody else's son ever treats his mother that way. The interview took place 2 days later. A young journalist named Amanda came to the house with a recorder and a notebook. She was kind, respectful, but sharp. She asked all the right questions. Grandma answered every one with quiet dignity. When Amanda asked me why I'd filed the case, I told her the truth. Because I watched my father teach me that success meant stepping on people. I just didn't realize he'd step on his own mother too. The article came out 3 days later. The headline read, Retired Colonel accused of exploiting elderly mother for $30. 000 European trip. It spread fast. Local TV stations picked it up. Online commenters tore into him. Some defended him, of course. But most didn't. By that evening, my phone was flooded with calls. My mother, my sister, unknown numbers. I didn't answer any of them. But when I saw a private number flash across the screen, I picked up. I knew it was him. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. You think you've won, he said. I don't care about winning. I said, I care about the truth. The truth, he repeated, laughing quietly. You have no idea what you've started. I think I do. You can't keep hiding who you are anymore. He paused. You've always been naive. Ethan, you think you're the hero here. You think people care about right and wrong. They don't. They care about reputation. And I built mine before you could even walk. Then you'd better hope it's strong enough to survive the truth, I said. He exhaled slowly. You just made yourself an enemy you can't handle. Funny, I said. I thought I already had one. He hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, my pulse pounding. I should have felt triumphant. But instead, I just felt tired. The kind of tired that comes from years of carrying a weight you didn't realize was yours to put down. Later that night, Grandma knocked softly on my door. You all right? She asked. Yeah, I said. Just thinking. She sat on the edge of the bed. You did the right thing. Ethan, it's not supposed to feel good right away. I know, I said. It just feels like something's coming. She took my hand. Then we face it. Together. Outside. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. The house creaked softly, as if it was listening. And somewhere across the city, I imagined my father sitting alone in a dark office, watching everything he'd built start to unravel. The next morning started quiet. The kind of stillness that feels like it's holding its breath before something breaks. I made coffee and went outside to water Grandma's garden, the air cool against my face. She came out a few minutes later in her robe, clutching the newspaper to her chest. Her hands were trembling slightly. It's worse, she said. The news stations picked it up. They're showing his picture. I took the paper from her. The headline read, Veteran Colonel faces investigation over elder fraud allegations. There was his face, stern and polished. The same photo he'd used for years at community events and charity banquets. The article mentioned me by name. 2. Son exposes financial misconduct in family dispute. Grandma's voice was soft. He's going to hate you for this. He already does, I said. She looked out toward the yard, the morning light catching in her silver hair. He'll come for me before he comes for you. I shook my head. Not if I can help it. That afternoon, I drove to Bill's office. He was waiting for me with a folder open on his desk. He's hired an attorney, he said. Aggressive one, too. The kind who doesn't care about right or wrong, just about winning. Let me guess. I said. He's claiming it was a misunderstanding. Bill nodded. He's also threatening to sue the Herald for defamation. Claims the article ruined his career. I laughed bitterly. He ruined his career the second he stole from her. Bill leaned back, studying me. Ethan, I know this has become personal, but you need to remember, men like your father don't think they've done anything wrong. To him, this isn't about justice. It's about pride. I rubbed my face with my hands. Then how do I beat him? You don't beat him, Bill said calmly. You let him destroy himself. That's what men like that do best. When I got home, Grandma was sitting on the couch surrounded by travel brochures. Italy, France, Vietnam. I raised an eyebrow. Planning our next move, she smiled faintly. Maybe. I spent too long waiting for someone to give me permission to live. I think I'm done with that. I sat beside her. You serious about going somewhere? She nodded. I was thinking about the trip your grandfather and I never took. Paris. He always said he'd take me to see the Eiffel Tower. I grinned. Then let's make it happen. Her smile faded slightly. You sure you can leave right now? You've already lost your job. I can always get another one, I said. But you can't get back lost time. We spent the rest of the evening planning. Flights. Hotels. Small details. For the first time in months, the house felt light again. She looked alive in a way I hadn't seen since before the airport. But the next day, that peace shattered. I was coming back from the store when I noticed a car parked across the street. Black sedan. Tinted windows. It wasn't one of the neighbors. When I pulled into the driveway, the engine started, and the car rolled slowly away. I caught the first 3 digits of the license plate before it turned the corner. Inside, Grandma was at the kitchen table, paying bills. I didn't tell her about the car. No point in worrying her. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something outside. A scrape. A shadow moving near the porch. I grabbed the baseball bat from my closet and stepped quietly into the hallway. Through the window, I saw him. My father. He was standing by the mailbox, his face half lit by the street lamp. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Then he looked up and our eyes met. I opened the door. What are you doing here? He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. We need to talk. You don't belong here. He smirked. You think you can keep me from my own mother's house? She doesn't want to see you. He laughed quietly. She told you that. Did she? You've filled her head with so many lies. Ethan, you always were good at playing the victim. I tightened my grip on the bat. You stole from her. That's not a lie. He moved another step closer. I took what was mine. She's been holding that money for years. I earned it taking care of her. You mean ignoring her? His jaw tightened. You don't understand what it's like to build something. To sacrifice. You've never done anything real in your life. I'm doing something real right now, I said, protecting her from you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then Grandma's voice came from behind me. Richard. He turned. She was standing in the doorway, her robe tied neatly, her voice steady. You need to leave. He looked stunned. Mom. He's turning you against me. She shook her head. No. You did that yourself. He took a step back like she'd struck him. After everything I've done for you, you took $30,000 from me, she said. And you tried to make me feel like it was my fault. That's not helping. That's cruelty. His face darkened. You'd believe him over your own son. I'd believe the truth, she said. And it's standing right here beside me. He stared at her, his mouth tightening, eyes flicking between us. You'll regret this, he said finally. No, she replied. I already regret raising a man who thinks love looks like control. He turned without another word, got in his car, and drove off. I stood there in the cold air, heart pounding, bat still in my hand. Grandma reached out and took it from me. He won't stop, I said. She nodded. No. But neither will we. The next day, Bill called again. The AG's office got word he's trying to counterfile, claiming emotional distress. He's blaming the media coverage for damaging his mental health. I almost laughed. That's rich. Don't worry, Bill said. They're not buying it. But I thought you should know. That night. I sat on the porch again. The neighborhood was still. The sky clear. I looked up at the stars and tried to imagine how it would feel to finally be free of him, to live without the shadow of his expectations. His manipulation. Inside. Grandma was humming softly while packing her suitcase. The sound of zippers and tissue paper. The gentle rhythm of someone reclaiming their life. I realized then that revenge wasn't about payback. It was about balance. About making things right. Not because it changed the past, but because it finally gave the future a chance to exist. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe we might actually get there. A week later, the air finally felt lighter. Grandma and I boarded our flight to Paris on a crisp April morning. The kind where the sky looks like it's been scrubbed clean after a storm. She was quiet but smiling. Her hands folded neatly in her lap as we lifted off. I watched her stare out the window, the clouds reflecting in her glasses. For the first time in a long time, she looked free. When we landed at Charles de Gaulle, the sunlight spilled through the glass terminal like gold. The city felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, chaotic, vibrant, unapologetically beautiful. Grandma took a deep breath and whispered, "James would have loved this." We spent the first few days walking, not rushing, not sightseeing the way tourists do, but really walking. She wanted to see the markets, the bakeries, the quiet streets behind Notre Dame. At one café near Saint-Germain, she sat across from me, stirring her coffee, and said, "I never thought I'd make it here. Not without him. Not after everything. You earned this." I said, "All of it." She smiled softly. Maybe. Or maybe I just stopped waiting for permission. That night, I got an email from Bill. The investigation had officially closed. My father had settled privately with the Attorney General's office, agreeing to a restitution payment and public apology. He'd resigned from his Veterans Association and was under review at Boeing for breach of ethics from his consulting work. His reputation was in shambles. Bill ended the message with one sentence: "He won't come after you again." I didn't know how to feel. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt a hollow sort of peace, like finishing a long race and realizing the finish line wasn't where I thought it would be. The next morning, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was tired. "He's not the same," she said. "He barely speaks. He spends most of his time in his office. He won't even look at me." "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "No," she said. "Don't be." Maybe this was what he needed, to finally see what he's become. We talked for a few minutes. Careful. Polite. Two people rebuilding something fragile. Before hanging up, she said, "Your grandmother raised a good man. Ethan, don't lose that just because he did." Later that day, Grandma and I took a river cruise down the Seine. The Eiffel Tower shimmered in the distance, its lights flickering against the dusk. She leaned against the railing, her scarf fluttering in the wind. "I think this is what happiness looks like," she said. "Yeah," I said. "I think so too." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the water carry us past bridges and city lights. I thought about how far we'd come from that airport in Seattle to this moment. Two people who'd been broken by the same man and somehow managed to piece themselves back together. When we returned to the hotel that night, there was a letter waiting at the front desk. No return address, just my name. I opened it upstairs while Grandma unpacked her things. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. It was from him. "Ethan, you got what you wanted. I lost everything. Maybe that makes you feel righteous. Maybe it even makes you proud. But someday, you'll understand that the world doesn't run on justice. It runs on control. I hope when you lose it, you handle it better than I did. Dad." I read it twice, then set it on the desk. For a moment, I felt that old anger stirring again, the one that always came when he tried to twist guilt into power. But then it passed. He was just a man now, not a force, not a shadow. Just a man facing the wreckage of his own choices. Grandma came out of her room, saw the letter in my hand, and asked softly, "From him?" I nodded. "Do you hate him?" she asked. I thought about it. "No," I said finally. "I just don't owe him anything anymore." She smiled, a little sadly. "Then you've already won." The next morning, We went to the top of the Eiffel Tower. The city stretched out beneath us, endless and alive. Grandma stood near the railing, eyes glistening, the wind tugging gently at her coat. She whispered something I almost didn't catch. "It's beautiful. Worth every storm." I didn't answer. I just put my arm around her shoulder and watched the sunrise paint the rooftops gold. A month later, we came home to Seattle. The garden was blooming again. Life felt quieter, steadier. Grandma started volunteering at the community center, teaching seniors how to manage their finances. She said it wasn't about the money. It was about helping people protect what they'd earned. As for me, I started a small firm, just me, a laptop, and a handful of clients who'd heard my story and wanted someone they could actually trust. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt honest. Every time I looked at my company's name on the door, Walker Financial Ethics Consulting, I thought about what it meant to rebuild something from the ground up. Sometimes I still get messages from my sister, short ones. She says Mom is doing better, that Dad spends most of his days fishing alone by the lake. I don't reply often, but I always read them. Part of me hopes one day, when he's ready, he'll pick up the phone and say something real. Maybe he won't, but that's on him now. Last week, Grandma called me from her garden. "You know, Ethan," she said, "it's funny. For all the pain he caused, I think he finally gave us something." "What's that?" I asked. "Freedom," she said simply. I looked around my quiet office, the sunlight spilling across the desk, and realized she was right. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to him. I was living my own life. So yeah, maybe justice isn't perfect, and maybe revenge doesn't fix everything. But sometimes, standing up for what's right is the only way to start again. If you've ever been there, if you've ever had to let go of someone who kept holding you down, tell me your story. Maybe someone else needs to hear it too. Stay here. Because next time, I'll tell you what happened when he finally called.